As we've seen time and again, pocket pistols were the go-to emergency sidearm for the Great War. And while we're very familiar with the Ruby as an icon among them, the French had another, possibly better, semi-automatic. Hi, I'm Othais, and this guy's pretty dang cool. This is the Pistolet Automatique Star, also known as the Model 1914. It's a bit small, so let's get a look at it in the light box. With an overall length of 8 inches and weighing in at 1.8 pounds, the Star is actually getting into almost full-sized handgun range, so I probably shouldn't have said small. Now, it has a magazine capacity of 9 rounds, single stacked, 32 ACP. So I guess it's still not really a full-size military handgun. Now, I'm going to be honest and say I've looked forward to doing this episode for some time, and yet somehow this is one of those guns that is kind of rare, and yet really kept dodging me for this episode. I'm very happy to do it today. And before I can discuss how this particular firearm made it into the war, we need to first explore how it came to be, and for that, we'll have to visit the Basque region of Spain. And more specifically, Eibar, an iron-rich arms-making community for centuries, which naturally turned to manufacturing gun locks in the 1700s. Just like we've seen in Liège, Belgium, this made Eibar a city of gunsmithing families. Usually, each household produced their own small parts. Some better off had, like small workshops, maybe even up to a small factory. They might even employ a half dozen or so other men. Many would alternate working for others or themselves freely, depending on what the market really could sustain at that moment and what they were good at. In time, a few names would begin to rise above the others. One would be Orbea Hermanos, a gun-making firm known for their pistols and revolvers. At one point, Orbea was responsible for 20% of all firearms sold from the Eibar region. Most famous among them was the Ona, that would eventually see use by both Great Britain and Italy in the Great War. But long before that, Orbea Hermanos had an employee by the name of Jose Cruz Echeverria, who managed to woo the sister of one of the owners, and together they would manufacture a son in 1859. Bonifacio Echeverria, who began his schooling in Eibar but later moved to Madrid to pursue studies in metallurgy. At the age of 20, he would return home and apprentice for various firms. Shortly after his son's return, Father Jose would leave the Orbea Hermanos company in 1880 to start his own business. It would change names several times as he partnered with and broke up with certain guys. In the end, in 1886, he settled into Echeverria e Ijo, expecting his son Bonifacio would join him. I'm not sure if he did, though. I've read rather, that he did not. But there's also some clues that say maybe he kinda did. This is really murky stuff. It doesn't really matter because that company sort of disappears off the records by 1895. Father and son both entered employment with another factory, Quintana Hermanos. Now, that Echeverria company would much later, way later in 1905, reform. This time, father and son set up their own workshop from the start together, and they had their own handgun design. Sort of. You see, in all of this, if it wasn't confusing enough, there was a third Echeverria. Julian had been born in 1875, nearly 16 years junior to Bonifacio. He had attended business school in Bilbao and taken a position with Fábrica de Canons de Plasencia de las Armas. Guys, I really only speak English. Before spending a brief period with a smaller factory, and then finally joining Garate and Etue Isia. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because we've seen this particular company before in our historical series. While working for this pistol maker, Julian discovered he had an interest and an aptitude for design and developed his own handgun. It was based on this, the La Lira, a Garate and Itua's adaptation of the Mannlicher 1901, now fitted with a detachable magazine. Julien's design was a vest version of the same with some small novel improvements, now chambering 25 ACP. A prototype was constructed by his father and brother who thought it had merit. But the family Echeverria did not have enough funds on hand to enter true production, so they would partner with a larger firm, Modesto Santos, who would have exclusive distribution for a fixed period. I'm unsure if this was based on time or units sold, but with the financial help secured, Echeverria, well, they were able to get to work on a production model. This was revealed in the 1908 Exposition of Art and Industry in Eibar, making what we would call the Model 1908, although that's more retroactively. Still chambering the 25 ACP cartridge, the Model 1908 was a much more significant departure from the La Lira, and therefore the Mannlicher pistol. The hammer was greatly simplified, as was the slide-mounted manual safety, which is really just a hammer block. Some very late models feature the block on the hammer itself. The magazine is a detachable heel release. The button that you see on the side of the frame is actually to release the plates for takedown. Around the same time as the pistol, Bonifacio trademarked a new logo and name for their overall company, Star. This would be applied to their semi-automatic handguns. Jose Cruz, the senior Echeverria, was hopefully happy to finally be working with both of his sons, and just in the nick of time, it would seem, as he passed away in 1909. With that, Echeverria e Hijo became Bonifacio y Julian Echeverria. And it was under this name that they released their second pistol, the N2 for number 2. That's simple enough. This Browning-style clone was another product of Julien. While interesting, it's not part of the evolution of our pistol today. Instead, it actually marks the exit of Julien, who would leave the firm in 1910, settling for a lump sum and royalties for future production. That leaves us with just Bonifacio Echeverria, and so his name became the name for the company. Our last Echeverria would still push for company growth, even without his lead designer. With just two 25 ACP pistols in the line, he sought a new market with the dynamic defensive cartridge 32 ACP. Yes, our favorite little cartridge that could. 32 ACP had been spread around the world by explosive success found in the FN 1900 pistol. Its small size and low power made it practical for an ever-growing number of pocket-sized blowback operated pistols, which is exactly what the next Star would be. In 1910, Bonifacio would drop this, a scaled-up version of the previous model. While some custom variations do exist, generally there were only two versions of this gun, a short barrel 7-shot and a long barrel 8-shot. I should also point out that a limited number of those 1910s were made in 380, a somewhat more aggressive short-cased 9mm cartridge, though this was, to my knowledge, the exception. Now, by the time of the 1910, Modesto Santos was no longer involved, and the Star line could be marketed through anyone. Still, it was a fairly small enterprise, with perhaps 8 employees at this point. A 1912 trade magazine lists Echeverria as producing some 20 pistols a day, which was fairly respectable in Eibar at that time. And now we need to take a bit of a left turn for a second. By 1910, the most advanced pistol in the Spanish army was the Bergmann Bayard 1908, not to be confused with the Bayard 1908, an updated version of the Bergmann Mars, which they had ordered but not wholly adopted back in 1905. While an excellent handgun, it apparently did not entirely overwhelm Spanish authorities, and they would seek other options. It appears that Bonifacio decided to make his own bid, as a handful of Star pattern pistols have been found chambering that Spanish Army 9mm Largo cartridge. What is now called the Model 1912/1914 by collectors is an even more scaled up Model 10. Notably, the heel release is gone, and now the magazine drops with a standard button, which means the takedown method was also moved, now to a screw in front of the trigger. Unlike previous Star pistols, this one has coarse checkered wooden grips and 2 attaching screws per grip. Now we know in hindsight that the Campo Giro would be the one to win the honor of next Spanish handgun. Interesting coincidence, Julian Echeverria would be one of the gunsmiths to help establish the factory in order to produce them. So the 1214s were prototypes at most, with no apparent commercial production. Many of their features would, however, be shrunk back down to the 32 ACP line and worked into a new model shown at the 1914 A-Bar Exposition of Art and Industry, which is, well, this model right here, more or less. Let's get a closer look. I want to point out this thing is very shiny. Despite its age and amount of abuse, you could tell that these were really high blue guns to begin with. Now obviously a blowback semi-automatic, but let's figure out what's going on here. Coming off the previous models, we now have what is probably pretty obvious, which is a spur to put on the back of that hammer. We've retained a lot of the military features like these coarse checkered grips, 2 screws, magazine releases there. Very positive. Check that out, guys. Look at that. Boom. Now this is a 9-rounder, but that was not necessarily a guarantee at the beginning. You can definitely see the influence of the A-bar type, Browning style 1903 clone in terms of the grip and everything. You can see the influence of the Mannlicher pistols all through the slide and even in this front release. So how would you use a gun like this? It's fairly obvious. You use the magazine release there. You grab the grip, you rack your slide to chamber one, there's no hold open, that comes right on forward, and your hammer is in the ready position. If you want to make the gun safe, well, good news, we're already there, because actually the safety position is with this guy down. In that position, let me get where I can show it to you. Let's see if I can get that to light up. There we go. There's a block, and if I flip this up to fire position, it'll rotate out of the way. So in the down position, nothing actually stops the hammer from dropping. It doesn't interfere with the trigger. It just blocks the firing pin. That's it. It just keeps the hammer from striking the firing pin. That's all. That's as simple as you can get. Now, the one thing I find odd about this, I'm surprised I don't see more damaged, is the fact that the fire position is high with this tab up in the air. I think that would take a pretty good whack once in a while, but I've yet to see one broken. So I guess it's not that bad after all. But again, terrifying in terms of safety, you just go ahead and do that. So you could carry one with one in the chamber, hammer down, and then do the manual cock and get ready to fire from there. Again, you can just ride this guy forward and gently let it rest on the primer for no reason. That's also an option, but not one I would want to bank on. Now, otherwise fairly simple. Like, there's nothing wild about this gun except for its appearance, and I should say the takedown method, which is handled, let's see, by this lever, which again comes from the Mannlicher family of pistols, and this texturing right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to depress this lever, and then you're going to push out on this. Let me see if I can do that without completely ruining your viewing experience. So press lever, pull forward, hey, not too bad, and then that whole piece slides out. Now this to me is again a delicate feature on this gun because, and I have seen these damaged in person before, these 2 little tabs right here, they worry me, especially taking damage from the front. That probably to me is the most vulnerable point in this whole system. Outside of that though, let's get over here and we'll see if we flip her up. We've got our spring down in there. Let me, yeah, that guy. Now, in theory, you can get 2 thumbs on that thing, so you can set it kind of like this, get 2 fingertips or 2 thumbs and pull that back. It's very difficult to do while showing you guys on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a screwdriver that's thin enough to kind of shim down in there. I'm going to use the corner of it because I'm seeking out the recession that's at the end of that plunger that's going to line up into the slide. So I'm just going to try not to chip anything up, but I don't want to let this fly either because it's a very stiff spring. Oh, okay, I got her, and we're clear. So we'll take out the spring and plunger. That's it. This is our recoil right here, guys. It doesn't look like a lot, but that is really inflexible. That is beefy. So Set this guy over here. We're gonna pop our hammer back just to give ourselves some room. I'm gonna get the magazine out of our way. We're gonna push this guy to the rear. Once she's to the rear, we can just tip her up and ride her back forward, past the latch, past the front of the gun, and we're clear. That is the takedown for this gun. You know, I'm not completely impressed given that we end up with a delicate, weird part. We end up with a small spring and plunger, and then we end up with two beefy bits. As cool as it is to do, like it's certainly like visually a spectacle. This is Transformers grade. I just don't know that it's that utilitarianly useful, especially when there's much simpler ways already available by this time. However, it was probably uniquely patentable in Spain at that period, which is a good protection for Star. Once we're inside here, we can see fixed barrel, obviously blowback system, no locking action, firing pin set down in there, and that's really it. Like an open top slide extractor overhead, so we're gonna have vertical ejection, and nothing else that's really fancy. I mean, short of going down in there and looking about how our trigger interacts, but super plain, but super well executed in terms of quality, which is really what's going to make this gun stand out against its contemporaries. Now, I should say that this gun is indicative of model 1914s for the war because there were several production variations, like an extended 10-round magazine with longer barrels and very, very few 380 and 25 ACP. But actually, realistically, they usually had one round fewer and a shorter barrel than this one, but we'll talk more about why in a moment. Instead, let's get a closer look inside this gun and understand how it works through one of Bruno's animations.
First, we'll load our magazine, which will displace the magazine release button until it snaps into place. Before we get started, note that this is the recoil spring for our system. You can watch it in action as we manually withdraw the slide and release it. Let's watch the trigger bar. As we pull the trigger, it will displace the sear to fire the pistol. During cycling, it will be cammed down, extending past the sear, in order to provide a disconnect until the trigger is released. Looking at the sear is simple and direct, powered by its own coil spring. Disconnection of the trigger comes from a simple vertical bar. It rides on top of the trigger's transfer bar, and when the gun is in battery, the disconnect fits in a notch inside the slide. When the slide is driven rearward on firing, the disconnect is driven downwards, pushing the transfer bar off the sear stud. The hammer has only one notch with which to engage the sear, and is driven forward by its own spring and plunger. When released by the sear, it strikes the firing pin, discharging the round. Turning our attention to the safety, it really is just a direct hammer block, preventing the hammer from making contact with the firing pin. Interestingly, spring tension for the safety is provided by the back of the extractor on most of these Star pistols. However, some wartime models had a separate arrangement. The extractor is also conveniently the extractor, pulling spent cases from the chamber straight into the ejector, which kicks them out the massive ejection port. Alright, time to get back to business.
I should also point out very clearly that the designation Model 1914 is a bit more retroactive. At the time, this would be just the next variation of the Star pistol, and as a matter of fact, for all of them, from the first 1908 until this gun here and on beyond that into the 1920s, they all shared one continuous serial range, which makes production numbers really hazy. The earliest known 1914 started in the 28,000s, with only a few thousand made before war were declared. Now, make no mistake, Bonifacio was prepared for something like this, because he had been slowly evolving his pistol towards a more martial role, which was good because neighboring fronts would need some help. Particularly, their then standard revolver model 1892 was not put back into production, as it would have taken away from the rifle manufacturer. Instead, they would have to turn to Spain, and in particular the Eibar region, for help providing auxiliary handguns. As we've seen previously, at least 2 Spanish revolvers would be fielded, clones of US designs now chambered in 8mm ordnance. I'll also add that we'll soon see a third in this family, although France rejected it. The revolvers weren't enough. France needed guns now, and they would continue to need more and more as the war progressed. Now, some of this was due to the expansion of the army, some of it was due to material losses in the fight. And yet, there's still more, because a lot of the increase had to do with the increase in the breadth to which handguns were being issued. Pistols were now required for pilots, couriers, artillerymen, sappers, machine gunners, and more. In trench warfare, the handgun was often more comforting than a rifle. And so, in August of 1915, having somewhat learned their lesson for the past year, the French army would sign a contract for 5,000 Star pistols, each with 3 extra magazines. The price? 35 pesetas. Alright, the order is in, and so this gun counts for the Great War, and that means Mae gets to shoot it.
Mademoiselle from Anvil, say to you, sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right now. Mademoiselle from Anvil. Standing on top of down, he put on his kilts one day, down with the blood merry and bright and gay. Out of the problem he strolled along, the wind was loud. Girl that turned her head, but only shut one eye. Why, Mademoiselle from Armandier's parlez-vous.
Now, I should probably specify 2 or perhaps 3 versions of this pistol were sold to France. Initially, they bought up the available commercial stock, and it's likely the earliest wartime production was the same, 130mm barrels, 8-shot magazines. These would later be called officers' models by collectors for their smaller size. I'm unsure when the Star was changed for the French army, but I'm guessing it was about the same time they started requesting 5 extra magazines per gun. I've also seen this written as just 4 extra magazines, but still they wanted more magazines. And it also meant a bump up in the price to 38 pesetas. Our gun today is the second type, 9 shots and a 138mm barrel. It has been over the years given the nickname Trooper, although the size does not seem to have actually affected how and where it was issued. It's also worth noting there were some manufacturing changes, like the extractor, which was actually shortened up in length. It used to have more of a role in retaining the safety, but that's being done with a separate pin now. As you can tell, the Star is a fairly complicated little handgun, and Bonifacio is very tight on the quality of his pistol, which makes it an excellent little 32, but also somewhat slow to produce, especially when the entire Eibar region was now running full throttle and help was getting hard to find. So Bonifacio would slowly fall behind on his deliveries, and suffering a financial penalty in 1916, in the end, Star would lose out their pistol to another design that we've already seen on this show, the A-bar type Ruby, an adaptation of the Browning 1903 patent, though greatly simplified and scaled up for lower quality metal. We actually have a whole episode on these guys, but in short, they were simpler to produce, meaning most A-bar gun makers could handle the manufacture of this gun, not the manufacturer of this one. They were also cheaper. Instead of the Star's 35 pesetas, the A-bar type with 3 magazines cost 31. While introduced to the French by Gabilondo y Resti, dozens of firms would soon follow, their combined efforts delivering nearly 1 million of these guns during the war, dramatically dwarfing the production of the Star. Well, if you can't beat them, you should join them. Echeverria would make their own A-bar type pistol, the Azara, Basque for, you'll never guess this one, Star. Not confusing at all, guys. By the way, as with all these guns, both the Azara and the Star had their magazines marked for fit. BE on the toe of the Stars, and an I on both the toe and the frame of the Azara. Recall, these were necessary because the wide variety of A-bar factories meant magazines from one maker in another's gun may not function. In the end, even Echeverria would produce more A-bar types, with roughly 27,000 shipped compared to fewer than 20,000 Stars. Wartime serials range from 31,000-ish to 49,000 or so, probably. If that latter number is correct, it also means that we get to see a third variation in our show. I actually have this guy here, which I stumbled into and have promised to a mustachioed gentleman. It's a transitional model, sporting a smaller magazine button, slightly longer hammer spur, and actually going back to the full-length extractor. This 1914 has a number of features generally associated with the post-war model 1919. But not all of them. 1919s also have swiveling lanyard loops and fuller spurs with no roundness to them, and they've replaced the main hammer screw with a hammer pin. So kind of weird that we see this while, the war is going on. Alright, that covers our production though. What about service? Well, once again, I'm stumped. I can't find a single account in which a soldier clearly identifies his Star, because it's both 32 ACP and the bulk of them were in 9-shot configuration. There's no real way to differentiate them from the Ruby in period stories. People back then really didn't just specify what gun they were holding. They wouldn't say, my Star. They would just say, I had a pistol and I dumped 9 rounds into somebody. Well, if you say that, I can't differentiate between the two of these guns. I can say the Star remained in French military manuals through 1939, which means they were not actively removed from service despite being retired out in the 20s. And likely, they saw a limited role in World War II. In absence of any real stories from the war, I'm going to tell you speculatively, they were better than the Ruby. The finish is superior, it's far more consistent between models, and the gun itself presents really well. It's quite comfortable. Now, because I don't have any facts of service from the war, I do kind of have to bribe you with something to keep this interesting. So I'm going to tell you a tangential story that has nothing to do with particularly these guns. The French army did contract with Echeverria about designing a new handgun during the war, and he completed several prototypes for trials, and they were officially adopted, and 50,000 were ordered, but the war ended before production began, and all the examples appear to have been lost in the Spanish Civil War. So I have no photos or drawings to share with you, unless someone has time to dig through the papers in the Spanish patent archives. And the reason I'm sad about this is because we do know what they were chambered for. 45 ACP. Turns out the French were going to make the jump to join the Americans. 1919 would have been a really wild year for arms in the Great War if we had managed to get that far. I think I'd prefer the lives saved, but it's still really weird to think what might have happened. Returning to Bonifacio, the man, well, he was awarded the French Medal of Honor for his service to the cause, and the wartime production had filled his wallet. He now had around 40 employees. This allowed him to move into a larger facility in 1919 where he focused on affordable, simple firearms. This allowed him to weather that following economic depression better than most of the other firms. I'm sure we'll see him again someday on this show. But before that, we have to talk to Mae and get her opinion on the Spanish Star. All right, gang, we have a Mae and we have a pistol. Now, in this case, I'm pretty happy about this. I'm not going to lie.
You can't start out the whole thing with that, because that's going to give them...
I'm not saying that I'm reviewing the gun as being good.
Oh, okay.
I'm just happy to have this in my hands.
Because it has been a battle to try to get a hold of one. Oh my God, it's taken us years.
This is not the rarest gun. They're uncommon, but they're not the rarest gun. But for a number of years, I've had my eye out for one. And a couple turned up early in the show's history, but we couldn't afford them.
Right.
And so few people collect them that we haven't had any offers other than possibly Ian.
And I would also argue earlier on, you were like, I'm certain I'm going to come across more of these because I have totally in the past.
So I finally found this one, and then Ian bought it because I can't compete with him. And then I found another one, and then Ian bought it because I can't compete with him. And then, finally, I found this one, which is a weirder transitional model, which got a certain person kind of excited enough to trade me out a jankier one. So I actually had to go find a super rare one just to get a regular one. And that's how I managed to pull this off.
Yay!
Running the show is weird sometimes. But we do have one in. Also, I could have just borrowed one, but nobody offered me one to loan.
Yeah, that was weird.
It was one of the few cases where we had to buy something because we just could not get the loan. I don't know what's going on.
Although at least we own it.
I know. Well, I'm never giving up, so nuts to you guys. It took me forever to get this. This is a trophy at this point. All right. Enough about that craziness, though. We have the Star 1914, and it is just a simple blow black 32. So we'll just wrap it up. You guys have a good one, right?
Bye.
Yeah. Let me give you this, and let's talk ergonomically what's going on, because that looks like a lot.
I do need to start out with saying, I feel like I need to be stripper clip loading this guy. Am I crazy? Because it makes me think of the Mannlicher, the 1905, makes me think of the Steyr Hahn just because of this bridge that's right here. It's so weird, right?
It definitely is inspired by the Mannlicher, although they kept stylistically that double hump ridge. So like
right here, hump. Honestly, this hump back here makes me think of the Luger. And then right up here, this weird bridge that's right here, the recessed bridge. You're like, clearly I'm putting a stripper clip in that.
And the best I can tell you is they probably were trying to keep it in order to have a reinforced breech face, but then also have that sort of fluting at the rear to get rid of weight.
Yeah, isn't this section like hollow right here or something? Like
no, that's your whole breech block. It's just that you've by taking out these scallops, you actually take out a fair bit of mass. So
well, there's that. I mean, they tried to save a little bit on it. That's good.
I also think it's just a stylistic thing. I think it just goes along with how the Mannlicher looks, and it's cool looking, you know?
I mean, this is also a really big gun too, so like it feels like it fits into those larger gun categories.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Like, give me a rundown on holding this gun.
So I do have to say, on the large part, this feels like a military pistol. Like when we think of the 32s that we've had previously, how tiny they've been, the Bayard, we just got through the Sauer, and then we get to this guy, I'm like, this feels like a military pistol. It's a full finger grip. I've got extra space. Even Othais with this big mitts can put his whole hand on here comfortably.
Yeah, it almost feels like a modern 9mm handgun grip.
It feels great. It really does. It feels like definitely a good point shoot kind of thing. Like there's no question on where my grip is riding on this one. I like the tail out back here. I can get a nice positive high grip on that. There's no problems with that. I do want to point out, this is a feature that I absolutely love. This mag release is the most modern mag release we have seen on a pistol here yet today for this series, for the 32s especially.
Yeah.
It's incredible because it's a nice positive button release. What has had that? Has anything else really had that yet?
Yeah, the problem is we're so out of order at this point. I'm sure we've had mag releases that aren't well, like the Luger's okay with a mag release.
Yeah, that's true. The Luger is okay with it, but like for the 32s, no, this is the king of the mag releases.
Well, when you think about World War I, having that mag release in a smart place like that, rare.
Yeah.
Really rare.
Incredibly rare. But I absolutely love that. And just in case it wasn't positive enough, it's got a nice little toe sticking out here in the front. Awesome. They had some really good forethought with that.
Yeah, that thing hucks them like a Nerf gun, though.
It's great. The safety, I kind of like it because it's a hammer block. So Othais probably talked about in the episode, I'm sure, like you can have the hammer back and then effectively you can leave the hammer back or not and just have the safety on and it just blocks the hammer. You can either have the hammer resting on it or hammer back and just flip it off when you're ready to go.
Yeah, so hammer back or hammer down, you're still safe.
Right. That's fantastic. I love that.
Now, the French actually preferred this feature, apparently. I'm not a big fan of it.
Really?
I think it functions. Don't get me in terms of being a dead simple safety. It works.
I think for simplicity's sake, it's great.
And it's a handover from the Mannlicher again. This is really it's an improvement on the Mannlicher's version of doing this, and it's a rolling chamber that blocks that hammer out, or that blocks the firing pin out from the hammer.
Right.
The thing that I don't like about it is ergonomically you have to cross back over the gun.
Right, which we've seen that on some previous pistols before.
Yeah, so to me, I don't think, it's a step down from like last episode's Sour, because that was right where you could work it.
Yeah.
However, I'm also not always, like, especially in the modern era, we've come around this idea of like the safety not being the thing. It's control of the trigger that becomes the thing.
Right.
But the French seem to prefer this, because this exact setup comes back in their like 1935 series of pistols.
So it was something they actually did want to keep going.
Yeah, they retain that simple hammer block. So that's something that came over from the Spanish firm that clearly stayed a positive experience in their military and fell into further development on totally different pistols.
For me personally, don't get me wrong, I agree with you on the placement on that. That is awkward that I have to reach around the hammer to take the safety off. I completely agree with you, that is annoying, but I am willing to trade that because of that mag release right there.
Yeah,
that's just too good of a feature to have where it's at. That's perfect placement.
Especially because we know that these were also bought with multiple magazines. So the idea was that you were going to change your mags, which gets to be pretty critical, especially because this is the second version that the French military had, so 9
rounds. Yeah,
magazine.
That's awesome. I've got 9 rounds, granted 32, but I've got 9 rounds.
We'll get to that in a moment. Let's get through the rest of the ergonomics, though.
Yes.
What's it like to manipulate that slide? How's the spring?
So I will say the spring on this one, it is very stiff. So you know it's coming. But because of these big, massive humps back here, there is no short stroking this guy. It is fantastic. It feels almost just like a Luger with how bulbousy they are. There is no slipping on this grip. Even if you were, like Othais was talking about, they milled it out here in the metal so that you can actually reach around the bulbs. And then on top of that, they got some checkering here on the sides to aid you with that. So there's really no slipping on that. So while this has a very strong spring in here, you really don't have any problems manipulating it.
Yeah, they've gone to like lighter slide because it's all cut away. I mean, this is all cut away. It's a fairly light breech block and slide. And so they have to do something because it's a blowback gun to mitigate that. So they're going to stiffen that spring way up.
Right.
But that's not so big of a deal because you can really grab on there and just look, and that thing is opening up no problem.
Fantastic, yeah. Now, the last thing I'll probably mention, and we normally don't really talk about it in ergonomics that often because it's not really things I handle on range or anything like that, but I did want to bring it up, is disassembling this guy seems a bit weird, right? It's not quite normal. It's not easy. It's not fast, I don't think.
Well, it's not even that. It's just that
They're tiny little parts.
It requires taking off an assembly that has 2 little fingernails.
Yeah.
And then you have to get in there and really get that spring out of there, which is a kind of pain in the butt. So to me, that's where this thing starts to fall apart. So that's the biggest problem I have with the system, is that the disassembly is needlessly complicated. I feel like it could have been a bulkier system with a screw on it, and it would have, or like a captive screw or something.
Yeah, that would have been much easier and just as pronounced, I think. But this one, unfortunately,
but it's not as elegant looking.
No, it's not. I would agree.
So.
But yeah, ergonomically, this feels like I finally got a military pistol here in a 32. It's fantastic. I really did enjoy that.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
It feels good.
Oh, the deep checkering, it presents well. Anyway, we're going into praise overload. So let's go to actually shooting this thing. What's it like to line up the sights and pull the trigger?
Yeah, the sights they're medium low. I mean, it's a nice deep V cut that's right there, but they're not remarkable.
I'd give it World War I 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10.
Yeah, it's definitely a good and a solid pass on
the average modern shooter would hate them. But at the time and with all the stuff we've seen, they're doing fairly well, above average.
Fantastic there. The trigger, I will say, I get that it's single stage, but it almost feels like it's 2-stage.
So
it's weird. It's got a lot of take up to it.
You get this a lot in these pistols, is there's spring pressure to push the trigger back out so it doesn't just sit there and flop.
Right.
But it's not actually a double sort of hump on the sear, so it's not really a 2-stage. There's just this sort of spring take up. And then you have a single stage sear that you actually pull through. And I found it to be acceptable, but what do you think?
Yeah. No, it was just unusual because I was like, is that two-stage? Like, I just remember questioning it the first time I shot it, and then there's just so much take-up that you're just like, oh no, I guess it is single stage. Like, you start to just question yourself in the middle of the first time shooting it. But I mean, other than that, the take-up is not like heavy or anything like that. I still thought it was a decent trigger.
Yeah, it's a smooth, medium weight trigger to me. I thought it presented well. I didn't have any problems with it whatsoever.
No, I didn't have any issues either. It didn't feel gritty. There wasn't really any
Which, by the way,
weird snags.
We need to remind you, this is a Spanish-made handgun. This is an A-bar handgun.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable for a Spanish-made.
Yeah. Okay, so it goes bang. How are we doing for recoil?
Recoil was not bad. It really wasn't, because there's just so much mass to this gun. I really think that probably brought everything down. And honestly, I've got a full grip. I didn't expect any snap and didn't have any really. It was barely there.
Yeah, I found it to be absolutely comparable with another Spanish-made French
with the
handgun.
Ruby. Mm-hmm.
The Ruby. Which actually, between the two now we have them both in hand, the Ruby crowds my fingers a bit. It's very heavy. Mm-hmm. And it has slightly less recoil than that gun because of that extra weight, but really not crazy.
No.
So, with all that said, does that mean that you find this one acceptable for combat? Because now we're looking at a 32 ACP that may actually be a usable combat firearm. Does it pass the test for you?
You know, it's interesting. In the past, we totally have discounted a lot of guns. Being at 32 was a big contributing factor, but I would argue it was usually twofold with that, because usually with it being a 32 in World War I, it was considered a pocket pistol. So they'd either just be really small, awkward to handle because of their size, and on top of that, I usually wouldn't get a lot of rounds. That's a big deal. But if you think of things like the Savage, where I had 10 rounds of 32, it was a decent sized gun, so it wasn't really awkward to handle. That, honestly, that one ended up getting a solid, or not a solid, but it was more like it just barely tipped into the yes category. Right. And that's where I feel this one's at. I wish it weren't in 32 because it would get an even better yes, in my opinion. So it is getting a yes, but it's kind of a soft yes because I've got that 32 cartridge I've got to worry about. So it is going to pass. I just don't think it's going to do as well as it could if it were in a better cartridge.
So the breakdown for me is that we've had, I would say, 3 acceptable 32s so far. The Ruby, it's a full-size grip, it's a heavy enough gun, recoil's under control, follow-up shots are easy, sights are clean, and it works.
Right.
It comes with multiple mags. The problem is changing them out quickly, not so great. Mm-hmm. Then we had the Savage, which we enjoyed, which was a 10-shotter, which is the part we really liked, and it had a medium full-size grip. Like, it was a decent grip. The rest of the gun was very small, though, which did make it a little snappy.
Right.
And so the Savage is sort of like the hybrid. It's like the ambassador between this and the actual pocket pistols.
I would agree. It's a weird middle ground.
But it had a weird toe release, and again, reloading, complete pain in the butt. So now we have a 9-shot 32 ACP with a full-size grip that presents well. So basically it has all the pros of the Ruby.
And the Savage.
Yeah.
With the cartridge number.
Yeah, 910, okay. But we have really fast reloading.
Yes.
Really easy reloading.
Incredibly easy, fast reloading on that one.
Yeah. I think this is getting in the yes category.
I think this might be, and you correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think this might be the top of the 32s that we have seen so far.
Yeah, I would, short of sitting down and really reviewing and double checking my notes.
Yes.
I think we're looking at King 32 right here. I think the Star 1914 might be the best 32 of the war.
The king of the 32s, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean, it's that or the Bayard, let's be honest.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay, well, I guess we're going to wrap this up on a positive note unless you have anything else.
Not especially. It's just, I still feel like every time I look at this gun, even though I've shot it, I still want to stripper clip load this thing. It's so weird to me that it's not, and I love that it's not.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to me that in the end, we have a gun that's a little over-engineered in some ways and under-engineered in others. Like, no locking system, none of that stuff. Really weird takedown. Unnecessary milling cuts all over it. Like, a lot of this stuff is just cosmetic. And yet, functionally, and it's dumb stuff. Like, look at the Sour. It's actually almost perfect that we did this right after the Sour. Because if you look at the Sour, that is a complicated, well thought out, pistol that achieved all of its design goals. And yet, fundamentally, I got to put my hand on it and point it.
Whereas this one, you can practically put your hand on, pull up, and it's ready to go.
I want to put my hand on it, point it, great. I want more rounds. Great. It hits the points it needs to hit, even though it's lazy on some of the other design points.
Yes.
And so that's what counts, though. What counts is what counts.
Right.
So,
for thinking of something that you're going to take it into battle and defend yourself with it. Yeah, I could see myself pulling this out as my secondary weapon, just being like, boom, boom, there we go.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, enough praise for the star. Let's get on to our credits, and afterwards you can see our updates. Thanks for tuning in.
Night, guys.
Alright gang, first and foremost I want to thank all of you who are either supporting us on Patreon or Subscribestar. That honestly has been the very large majority of funds that we have had for this program for the number of years we've been doing it. And we're finally getting into that period where I think we can actually manage a little bit of growth because of your support. And that is going to be excellent because I have so many more stories I want to tell you guys. I'd like to tell them a little bit faster. Don't forget, by the way, if you're wondering what happened with Anvil, they are set up on their own separate channel. That link will be available in the description of this video for quite some time. Now, in addition to all that, I want to make sure that I very proactively encourage you all to go out and look at a couple of books that are available from Leonardo and Antaris. This is a man who wrote the book that we heavily reference for today's episode on the Star Firearms. He also has another one out on, I believe, the Astra pistols, and he's done a lot of direct research for these guns. And if I'm being honest, they're excellent books that are filled with details, and more so than a lot of the books I've read, they're told in a very simple, chronological way. I highly recommend these if you've had any interest in Spanish firearms. They're super cool books. Alright, that's all for today. Hope you guys have a good one.